Think you know the age of exploration? What if I told you Columbus's famous journey was just one piece of a much larger, more incredible puzzle? Prepare to challenge everything you thought you knew about the daring voyages that truly reshaped our world and uncover the forgotten heroes and groundbreaking discoveries often left out of history books. The world that existed before the great maritime voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries was a world bound by limits. Limits of geography, limits of imagination, and limits of interconnected knowledge. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, never knowing what lay beyond the familiar horizons that enclosed their daily existence. Maps were at once spectacular creations and humble emissions of ignorance. Vast portions of the globe were marked not with coastlines and nations, but with swirling illustrations of sea serpents, monstrous creatures, or simple blank spaces labeled terra incognita. Yet the unknown did not silence human curiosity. Long before any European navigator set his course into the Atlantic or Indian Oceans, the world had been shaped by travelers, traders, philosophers, and astronomers whose knowledge slowly expanded the boundaries of what humanity believed possible. It was within this pre-exploration world, rich with ambition yet constrained by distance, that the true age of exploration began to take form. The centuries leading up to the rise of transoceanic voyages were filled with tensions that pushed societies to look outward. Europe, recovering from the devastation of the Black Death, was rapidly changing. Population growth renewed demand for resources and luxury goods, cities were expanding, literacy was rising, and merchants formed networks that carried both goods and ideas across continents. The Silk Road remained the most important artery of global commerce, connecting the Mediterranean with the wealth of Asia. But the Silk Road was also fragile. Political instability along its many segments, particularly after the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, made long-distance trade risky. Prices of Eastern spices skyrocketed, and kingdoms like Portugal and Spain saw a tantalizing opportunity. If a sea route could bypass intermediaries and reach Asia directly, unimaginable wealth could be claimed. But this desire for profit was only one thread in a much larger tapestry of motivations. There was also a profound spiritual and intellectual hunger that shaped the minds of Europe's leaders and explorers. Christianity, long established as Europe's dominant faith, saw expansion into unknown lands as both a divine duty and a strategic necessity. Missionaries dreamed of spreading their teachings to distant peoples, while monarchs imagined alliances with mythical Christian rulers rumored to exist somewhere in Africa or Asia. At the same time, the revival of classical learning, fueled by Arabic translations of Greek philosophy and new discoveries in mathematics and astronomy, produced a generation of scholars who challenged old assumptions about the shape of the world and humanity's place within it. Universities and courts became centers of debate, where cosmographers, mapmakers, and inventors refined the tools that made long-distance navigation possible. Compasses, astrolabes, improved hull designs, and revolutionary new sails transformed ships from coastal vessels into machines that could cross entire oceans. While Europe prepared itself for expansion, it was far from the only center of maritime or exploratory ambition. In fact, long before any Iberian ship sailed into the unknown, China had already demonstrated extraordinary naval capabilities. During the early 15th century, under the leadership of Admiral Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty dispatched enormous fleets known as the treasure voyages. These ships dwarfed anything Europe had yet produced, carrying thousands of sailors across the Indian Ocean to East Africa and beyond. Their journeys were not driven by conquest, but by diplomacy, trade, and a desire to display imperial magnificence. Yet, despite their achievements, the voyages were eventually halted due to shifting political priorities within China, leaving a void that European powers would soon attempt to fill. This global context, the simultaneous rise and retreat of exploration in different parts of the world, created a unique historical moment in which Europe's maritime ambitions would reshape the planet. Into this evolving world stepped the figure Christopher Columbus, whose name would become synonymous with exploration, discovery, and controversy. But the story of the Age of Exploration is far greater than any single individual. Columbus did not create the forces that drove his voyages. He was a product of them. Even his bold belief that the world was round and could be crossed westward to reach Asia was neither original nor revolutionary. Many scholars before him had proposed similar ideas, although Columbus underestimated the size of the Earth by thousands of miles. What truly set him apart was not the novelty of his theories, but the tenacity with which he pursued them. Rejected repeatedly by European courts, he finally secured support from Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, whose recent conquest of Granada marked the completion of the Reconquista and freed resources for new ambitions abroad. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he entered an Atlantic world that was far more interconnected than many assume. Norse explorers had reached North America centuries earlier, although their limited settlements eventually faded from historical memory. West African kingdoms had long navigated the coasts, and some oral traditions even describe expeditions that attempted to cross the ocean. The Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores had already been colonized by Europeans, serving as crucial stepping stones into deeper waters. Columbus's journey did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of generations of experimentation, ambition, and maritime evolution. His journey, however, possessed a symbolic power that none before him had achieved, because it opened the door to sustained European contact with the Americas, setting in motion events that would transform ecosystems, societies, economies, and political structures on a global scale. The world Columbus encountered was neither empty nor untouched. The Americas were home to millions of people and hundreds of distinct cultures, with sophisticated agricultural systems, political institutions, and spiritual traditions. Civilizations such as the Maya, Aztec, and Inca had built monumental cities and developed complex astronomical knowledge long before European contact. Their trade routes stretched across mountains, forests, and coastlines, revealing a vibrant and interconnected world that challenged any simplistic notion of discovery. The arrival of European explorers marked the beginning of a dramatic and often tragic chapter in the history of these societies. But it also revealed the profound diversity of human achievement across continents. The Age of Exploration, therefore, must be understood not as a story of Europeans merely expanding outward, but as the moment when multiple worlds, each with its own history and complexity, collided and began to reshape one another. Yet, even as Columbus's voyages captured the imagination of Europe, they also ignited fierce debates among scholars, religious leaders, and monarchs. His reports described lands filled with potential wealth, but they also challenged traditional worldviews. The presence of entirely unknown peoples raised theological questions about the origins of humanity. Were these new populations descendants of the biblical Noah? Were they in need of conversion, or did they possess their own divine revelations? The debates that followed were not merely academic. They shaped policies of colonization, missionary activity, and governance that would define the next centuries. These early encounters forced Europeans to confront the limits of their own knowledge and grapple with the ethical implications of expansion. The Age of Exploration was as much an intellectual revolution as it was a geographical one. The drive for further voyages intensified rapidly. Other explorers saw opportunities to achieve fame and fortune by sailing beyond the routes Columbus charted. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to India shattered any remaining doubts about the viability of oceanic navigation and ushered Portugal into a golden age of maritime dominance. His return, laden with spices, transformed global trade and demonstrated the immense profits that awaited those who reached Asia by sea. Meanwhile, Spain continued to commission expeditions across the Atlantic, seeking both wealth and territorial claims. Each voyage expanded Europe's understanding of the world, revealing new coastlines, climates, and cultures. But these journeys also exposed sailors to immense dangers: storms, shipwrecks, scurvy, starvation, and the constant uncertainty of venturing into uncharted waters. At the heart of the Age of Exploration was a paradoxical mixture of courage and ambition.
scientific curiosity and economic greed, idealism and exploitation. Explorers often saw themselves as heroes embarking on noble quests, yet their actions frequently brought devastating consequences for the peoples they encountered. The introduction of European diseases to the Americas caused catastrophic population declines, altering the demographic landscape long before conquest or colonization took full effect. At the same time, the arrival of new crops, animals, and technologies initiated an unprecedented exchange between continents, an exchange that scholars now refer to as the Columbian Exchange. This process reshaped diets, economies, and environments across the globe, making the Age of Exploration one of the most transformative eras in human history. The early decades of exploration also saw the rise of new forms of cartography that reflected Europe's expanding worldview. Mapmakers, previously constrained by limited information, now had access to first-hand observations from sailors who described distant coasts and unfamiliar geographies. These new maps were not merely practical tools, they were expressions of power. By charting unknown lands, European kingdoms claimed symbolic authority over territories they had not yet conquered. Maps became instruments of empire, blending art and science with political ambition. They revealed a world that was rapidly becoming more interconnected and more contexted. Rivalries between Spain and Portugal heightened to such an extent that the Pope intervened, issuing the Treaty of Tordesillas, which attempted to divide the non-European world along an imaginary meridian. Although the treaty would prove imperfect, it underscored how swiftly exploration was reshaping global politics.
Underlying all these developments was a profound shift in how humanity understood the planet itself. The belief that the world was bounded by unknown dangers slowly gave way to the realization that it was navigable, measurable, and ultimately knowable through observation and experience. This shift did not occur overnight, nor was it embraced by all. But with each voyage, with each new charted coastline, and with each encounter between distant cultures, the collective knowledge of humanity grew. The Age of Exploration pushed societies to question inherited assumptions and to imagine possibilities that had once seemed beyond reach. It was a time of extraordinary ambition, driven by the conviction that the world was vast, filled with wonders and waiting to be discovered, though often at great cost. The stage was now set for a series of expeditions that would take European explorers far beyond the lands Columbus first encountered. They would venture into the Pacific, trace the coasts of South America, search for the elusive passage to Asia, and circumnavigate the globe. They would meet powerful empires, negotiate fragile alliances, and face resistance from communities determined to defend their homelands. The world was on the brink of becoming fully connected, and the consequences of this transformation would echo across centuries. The Age of Exploration had only just begun, and its story would unfold through triumph and tragedy, innovation and conflict, discovery and domination, shaping the world we know today. The momentum that followed the earliest Atlantic voyages created an atmosphere of restless ambition throughout Europe. News of strange new lands, unfamiliar peoples, and vast opportunities for wealth circulated rapidly through royal courts, merchant guilds, and scholarly circles. The early reports were often exaggerated, filled with wonder and speculation, but they achieved their purpose. They ignited a fierce competition among emerging European powers. Spain and Portugal stood at the forefront, driven not just by curiosity, but by the geopolitical urgency of expanding influence before their rivals could. It was this rivalry, coupled with rapidly advancing maritime technology, that propelled Europe deeper into the uncharted world, transforming exploration into a defining project of the era. Yet the expansion of voyages was not fueled by European ambition alone. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, well-established networks of commerce continued to thrive, and these regions played a central role in shaping the encounters that followed. The kingdoms along the West African coast, for instance, were neither isolated nor unaware of the changes unfolding beyond their shores. They had engaged in trade for centuries, exchanging gold, ivory, and other commodities with both North African and Mediterranean merchants. As European ships began appearing more frequently along their coasts, African rulers recognized opportunities as well as risks. Some saw the new arrivals as potential partners, who might provide military advantages or luxury goods. Others viewed them as destabilizing forces whose motives were unclear. These early interactions were marked by negotiation, alliance building, and power dynamics far more complex than the simplistic myths of European dominance that later emerged. As voyages extended farther south along the African coastline, Portuguese mariners refined their understanding of winds, currents, and weather systems, gradually mastering the Atlantic's unpredictable environment. Their success in reaching the Cape of Good Hope was not a sudden breakthrough, but the cumulative result of decades of observation and experimentation. Passing the Cape opened the gateway to the Indian Ocean, a region whose maritime history long predated any European presence. There, powerful trading cities stretched from the Swahili coast to the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean Trade Network was the most vibrant and interconnected marketplace in the world, linking spices, textiles, ceramics, metals, and ideas across thousands of miles. When Europeans arrived, they entered an ecosystem far more complex than they had imagined, and their role within it would be shaped by the ambitions and strategies of the established powers already controlling these waters.
The arrival of Vasco da Gama in India was a defining moment because it revealed the vast economic potential that direct maritime routes offered. His first interactions, however, were not triumphant. Local rulers viewed his gifts as unimpressive and his intentions as suspicious. The Portuguese lacked the legitimacy and diplomatic knowledge needed to navigate the political landscape of the Indian Ocean world. What they did possess was a willingness to use force in pursuit of commercial advantage, a strategy that would increasingly define European expansion. When da Gama returned to Portugal, he carried spices and news of a route that promised enormous wealth, but he also carried the seeds of conflict that would soon reshape the balance of power in the region. Subsequent expeditions were far more militarized, aiming not merely to participate in trade, but to control it through coercion and naval dominance. While Portugal looked eastward, Spain continued to push west across the Atlantic, driven by the evolving realization that the lands Columbus had reached were not the eastern fringes of Asia, but an entirely separate continent. This realization unfolded slowly, shaped by the reports of sailors who ventured along the coasts of the Caribbean and the Americas. As more expeditions set sail, the enormity of the newly encountered lands became undeniable. Dense forests, vast rivers, towering mountain ranges, and enormous populations presented a world of staggering scale and diversity. The initial confusion about where these lands fit within the global geography gradually gave way to a deeper understanding that the Earth was far larger than previously imagined. In this period of uncertainty and discovery, imagination often filled the gaps left by limited knowledge. Explorers spoke of golden cities, powerful empires, and strange natural wonders, blending observation with speculation in ways that influenced European expectations. Amid this growing curiosity, the significance of indigenous societies began to reveal itself. The Caribbean islands had already demonstrated that European contact could disrupt entire ecosystems and cultures. But the mainland of the Americas held civilizations whose complexity rivaled or exceeded those of Europe. The Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica and the Inca Empire in the Andes dominated vast territories with sophisticated administrative systems, agricultural innovations, and elaborate religious traditions. Their cities were architectural marvels, filled with temples, palaces, and markets that reflected centuries of cultural development. European explorers who first encountered these empires were both astonished and unsettled, for these societies challenged assumptions about the uniqueness of European civilization. The realization that powerful and highly organized states existed beyond Europe undermined long-held notions of cultural superiority, even as explorers prepared to exploit divisions and vulnerabilities for their own gain. As Spain turned its attention toward the mainland, its expeditions grew more ambitious and increasingly driven by a mixture of economic desperation and imperial ambition. The quest for gold became an obsession, fueled by rumors of unimaginable wealth in the interior. This pursuit led explorers deeper into unfamiliar and often hostile territory, where they encountered resistance from indigenous communities determined to protect their lands. Yet the Europeans also encountered opportunities for alliance, as rival factions and local disputes created openings for manipulation. The dynamics of conquest were not predetermined. They unfolded through specific encounters shaped by political strategy, cultural misunderstanding, and sheer contingency. For every successful expansion, there were disastrous failures. Expeditions lost to disease, starvation, storms, or resistance. The age of exploration was never a linear march toward domination, but a chaotic and uncertain struggle against both nature and human complexity.
Meanwhile, the intellectual landscape of Europe continued to evolve in response to the new discoveries. Scholars debated the meaning of the expanding world, analyzing reports from explorers to refine their theories about geography, climate, and natural history. Universities and royal courts became centers of inquiry, where sailors' accounts were compared with ancient texts, often revealing contradictions that forced scholars to reconsider long-trusted authorities. The classical writers who had shaped medieval understanding of the world, Ptolemy, Pliny, Strabo, were no longer sufficient for explaining the new knowledge emerging from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Cartographers updated their maps repeatedly, adding new coastlines while leaving vast interior spaces blank, acknowledging the limits of current understanding. These maps, though still incomplete, represented a profound shift in perspective. The world was no longer a mysterious abstraction, but a tangible and measurable space waiting to be filled with empirical observation. The transformation in scientific attitudes was accompanied by changes in cultural and economic life. Merchants who once relied solely on overland trade routes now invested in maritime ventures, financing expeditions that promised high risks and high returns. Ports that had been regional centers of commerce began to flourish on a global scale, as spices, silver, textiles, sugar, and other commodities flowed through them. The economies of Europe became increasingly intertwined with distant markets, creating new wealth but also new inequalities. Luxury goods once reserved for the elite became more widely available, altering patterns of consumption and social behavior. Yet this growing prosperity came at a cost. The labor systems that supported these new global exchanges often relied on exploitation. Indigenous populations were forced into grueling labor, and as their numbers declined due to disease and violence, Europeans turned increasingly to the transatlantic slave trade, forever altering the demographic and cultural landscape of multiple continents. The geopolitical consequences of exploration were equally profound. As Spain and Portugal expanded their claims, other European nations, England, France, and the Netherlands, watched closely, recognizing that participation in overseas ventures was essential for asserting their status on the global stage. These emerging powers studied Iberian techniques, hired experienced sailors, and gradually developed their own maritime strategies. They also questioned the legitimacy of papal decrees that attempted to divide the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. By the early 16th century, the idea that any single authority could allocate entire hemispheres to two favored nations appeared increasingly untenable. Competition intensified, and exploration became not only a race for wealth, but also a test of national identity and technological sophistication. The seas were no longer open spaces. They had become contested arenas, where empires clashed and histories intertwined. As the first half-century of exploration unfolded, the human encounters that shaped the era became increasingly complex. European explorers relied heavily on indigenous knowledge, guides, translators, navigators, and political intermediaries who understood the local landscape far better than any newcomer. Without this assistance, many expeditions would have failed entirely. Yet, these relationships were fragile, shaped by mistrust, cultural misunderstandings, and shifting alliances. Some indigenous groups initially welcomed European partnerships, hoping to leverage them against rival communities. Others resisted from the outset, recognizing the threat posed by foreign intrusion. In most cases, the consequences of alliance or resistance were unpredictable, as European intentions shifted with circumstances and leaders' ambitions evolved. Even within European crews, tensions were common. Mutiny, desertion, and conflict among officers reflected the immense pressures and uncertainties of long voyages and unfamiliar environments.
Religion played a central role in these encounters as well. Missionaries accompanied many expeditions, believing that the spread of Christianity was a moral duty and a divine mission. They often approached indigenous societies with a mixture of admiration and condemnation. Admiration for their cultural sophistication and condemnation for their spiritual beliefs. Attempts at conversion varied widely in tone and strategy, sometimes emphasizing education and dialogue, other times relying on coercion or political pressure. The clash between religious worldviews was not simply a matter of faith, it reflected deeper questions about identity, power, and the nature of human society. For Europeans, converting indigenous peoples was a way to legitimize territorial claims and reshape new colonies in their own image. For indigenous communities, religious encounters challenged long-standing traditions and often preceded broader social upheaval. By the early 16th century, it had become evident that exploration was transforming not just the physical understanding of the world, but also the psychological landscape of Europe. The existence of unknown continents, vast oceans, and powerful civilizations disrupted traditional narratives about humanity's origins and destiny. The idea that the world was comprehensible, orderly, and divinely arranged came under increasing scrutiny as scholars grappled with the implications of what explorers described. Newly encountered animals, plants, and landscapes defied classical explanations, suggesting that nature was far more varied and complex than previously believed. Philosophers debated whether the peoples of the Americas possessed the same intellectual and moral capacities as Europeans, leading to heated arguments about the nature of human rights, justice, and the legitimacy of conquest. These debates were not abstract. They influenced policies governing treatment of indigenous peoples and shaped the ethical framework of emerging colonial empires. Yet despite the rapid expansion of knowledge, enormous uncertainties remained. Much of the world was still unexplored, and even the areas Europeans had reached were poorly understood beyond coastal regions and initial points of contact. Speculation filled the gaps. Speculation about the size of continents, the existence of inland seas, the shapes of mountain ranges, and the routes that might connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. One of the most persistent dreams was the existence of a western passage to Asia, a dream that would inspire some of the most ambitious expeditions of the era. The search for this passage symbolized the enduring mixture of curiosity and commercial ambition that defined exploration. It also reflected the ongoing belief that the world still held secrets waiting to be uncovered, mysteries that could only be solved by those bold enough to challenge the horizons known to their ancestors. As the age of exploration entered its next phase, the world stood on the brink of becoming fully interconnected. The voyages completed thus far had revealed new lands, established unprecedented exchanges of goods and ideas, and initiated profound cultural transformations. But the most dramatic developments were yet to come. Future expeditions would cross the Pacific, chart the coasts of North and South America, and undertake the first circumnavigation of the globe. These voyages would deepen Europe's understanding of the world, while magnifying the consequences, both creative and destructive, of global expansion. The age of exploration was not merely a historical moment, it was a turning point in the human story, a chapter that redefined what it meant to inhabit a planet bound together by oceans, curiosity, ambition, and the relentless desire to discover what lay beyond the known world. The era that followed the earliest Iberian voyages marked a turning point in humanity's understanding of the world. Explorers were no longer merely probing coasts or cautiously entering familiar waters. They were venturing into spaces that had, until then, existed only in myth and speculation. The Atlantic had revealed unexpected continents, and the Indian Ocean had opened itself to foreign navigators. But the Pacific, vast, mysterious, and unimaginably expansive, remained largely unknown.
It was during this transformative period that European ambition, driven by economic desires, royal competition, and the intoxicating prospect of global power, turned toward what many believed would be the ultimate geographical revelation, a route around or through the newly encountered Americas that could lead directly to Asia. This quest would bring forth extraordinary voyages, some triumphant and others disastrous, but all of them would reshape not only maps, but the very fabric of global history. The search for a western route to Asia became the great obsession of the early 16th century. Even as it became clear that the lands Columbus reached were not Asia, but an immense barrier separating the Atlantic from the Pacific, hope persisted that somewhere among these new continents lay a hidden passage. This belief was reinforced by the fragmentary reports brought back by explorers who traced portions of the American coastline. Each newly charted bay or river mouth prompted speculation. Perhaps this inlet led to an interior sea. Perhaps this channel sliced through the landmass. Perhaps Asia lay just beyond a narrow strip of earth. Although most of these hopes would prove false, they played a critical role in motivating expeditions that expanded the known geography of the world far beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. One of the earliest figures to push beyond the initial boundaries of exploration was Vasco Núñez de Balboa, a Spanish adventurer whose determination and audacity mirrored the spirit of the era. After hearing indigenous accounts of a vast body of water lying to the west, Balboa led a grueling expedition across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1513, he stood upon a peak overlooking the Pacific Ocean, becoming the first European known to have seen it from the Americas. The sight was both exhilarating and humbling. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, shimmering like a promise and a warning. Balboa's discovery confirmed that the lands Columbus encountered were not Asia, and that another ocean, larger and more mysterious than the Atlantic, awaited exploration. Yet the very immensity of the Pacific posed immense challenges, for Europe lacked the knowledge and resources necessary to navigate such an ocean with confidence. The realization that two great oceans separated Europe from Asia did not deter explorers. Rather, it intensified their determination to find a westward route. Among those captivated by the possibility was Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator whose vision extended beyond the horizons that had limited his contemporaries. Magellan believed that somewhere at the southern tip of the Americas lay a strait that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. He gathered evidence from maps, legends, and accounts of earlier voyages, convinced that the elusive passage existed. When Portugal refused to support his plan, Magellan turned to Spain, which seized the opportunity to challenge Portuguese dominance in Asian trade. Magellan's expedition, launched in 1519, would become one of the most monumental undertakings in the history of exploration.
From the moment the fleet departed, it was clear that this journey would test every limit of human endurance. Storms battered the ships as they traveled down the coast of South America, forcing them to seek shelter repeatedly. The challenges of navigation were immense, for the coastline was unfamiliar and the charts available to Magellan were often speculative or inaccurate. As weeks turned into months, tensions within the crew escalated. Some officers doubted Magellan's leadership, others feared that the promised strait was a myth. Mutiny erupted, and Magellan was forced to confront the reality that exploration was not merely a struggle against nature, but a battle within his own ranks. Despite these obstacles, he pressed onward, driven by the unwavering belief that the route he sought lay just beyond the next headland. When the fleet finally reached the entrance to what would later be named the Strait of Magellan, the sense of triumph was profound. Yet this triumph was tempered by the daunting passage that lay ahead. The strait was treacherous, twisting through narrow channels flanked by steep cliffs and unpredictable winds. The cold was biting and provisions were dwindling. Many sailors believed they would never emerge from this labyrinth. But after weeks of cautious navigation, the ships broke into the open waters of the Pacific. The ocean before them was vast and calm, so unlike the stormy Atlantic that Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. What they did not yet know was that crossing it would prove far more perilous than anything they had yet endured. The Pacific crossing was a nightmare of deprivation.
The distances involved were far greater than Magellan had estimated, and the fleet sailed for months without sight of land. Food supplies spoiled or ran out entirely. Sailors gnawed on leather straps, sawdust, and anything remotely edible as scurvy decimated the crew. The suffering was unimaginable, yet the ships pressed on, driven by the hope that land and the riches of Asia lay somewhere beyond the horizon. When they finally reached the islands of the Philippines, the survivors were emaciated and weakened. It was there, on the shores of an unfamiliar world, that Magellan met his end in a conflict with local warriors. Although he did not live to see the completion of his vision, his expedition achieved what had once seemed impossible. Under the leadership of Juan Sebastian Elcano, the remaining ship continued westward, eventually reaching the Spice Islands and then returning to Spain by sailing around Africa. When the battered vessel arrived in 1522, it became the first ship in history to circumnavigate the globe. This achievement shattered the remaining doubts about the size and shape of the Earth. The world was no longer an abstract concept, but a navigable sphere whose dimensions, though still imperfectly understood, were now grounded in empirical experience. The exploration demonstrated that oceans were not impassable barriers, but highways connecting distant peoples and lands. It revealed the true scale of the planet and underscored the interconnectedness of every region within it. Exploration was no longer a matter of speculation, it had become the systematic expansion of global knowledge.
Even as Magellan's voyage transformed European understanding, the push to explore and exploit the Americas intensified. Reports of powerful empires filled with gold, silver, and elaborate cities reached the courts of Europe, sparking new expeditions led by ambitious men who saw opportunity in the vast and unfamiliar landscapes. Among the most famous, or infamous, of these figures were Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, whose encounters with the Aztec and Inca empires would alter the course of history. Their stories were not merely tales of conquest, but reflections of the complex dynamics that shaped early encounters between Europe and the Americas. Cortés's march into the heart of the Aztec Empire revealed a world of immense sophistication. The capital city, Tenochtitlan, astonished Europeans with its architecture, markets, canals, and imposing temples. The interactions between the Spanish and the Aztecs were marked by diplomacy, suspicion, cultural misunderstanding, and ultimately violence. The conquest that followed was neither inevitable nor straightforward. It unfolded through alliances with indigenous groups opposed to Aztec rule, outbreaks of disease that weakened local populations, and strategic decisions made under intense political pressure. The fall of Tenochtitlan reshaped the political landscape of Mesoamerica and set a precedent for European strategies of domination across the hemisphere. Pizarro's encounter with the Inca Empire mirrored this pattern of complexity and opportunism. The empire was already destabilized by internal conflict when the Spanish arrived, making it vulnerable to external forces. Pizarro exploited this turmoil, using deception and military force to capture the Inca emperor Atahualpa. The subsequent collapse of Inca authority was swift and devastating, opening the Andes to European control. These conquests enriched Spain beyond anything previously imaginable, flooding Europe with silver that would transform global economies. Yet, they also triggered immense suffering, cultural destruction, and demographic collapse among indigenous populations. The age of exploration had revealed the vastness of the world, but it had also unleashed consequences that would reshape societies for centuries.
Yet, despite the expanding horizons and growing body of empirical knowledge, much of the world remained unknown to European cartographers. The interior of North America was still largely uncharted. Vast regions of South America, Africa, and Oceania were blank spaces on maps, inviting speculation and imagination. Explorers continued to search for mythical lands, hidden empires, and uncharted passages. Stories of cities of gold, giants, and creatures unseen in Europe circulated widely, illustrating how myth and reality intertwined during this era of exploration. These legends were not merely fantasies. They influenced decisions, fueled expeditions, and shaped expectations.
They demonstrate that exploration was as much a psychological journey as a geographical one, pushing individuals and societies to confront the unknown and grapple with their own hopes and fears. By the mid-16th century, the age of exploration had fundamentally transformed global relations. Goods, ideas, and peoples now circulated across oceans with increasing regularity. The world was becoming interconnected in ways that no previous civilization had experienced. The consequences were vast and far-reaching. European economies grew wealthier and more powerful, allowing nations to finance further exploration, build larger navies, and extend their influence. Indigenous societies across the Americas faced profound disruption as disease, forced labor, and cultural suppression altered their ways of life. Africa, too, would soon experience devastating consequences as European demand for enslaved labor expanded. Meanwhile, Asia confronted new commercial pressures and strategic challenges as Europeans established fortified outposts along key trade routes. And yet, for all these disruptions, the era remained one of remarkable human resilience and adaptability. Indigenous cultures survived, adapted, and resisted in countless ways. Not all encounters were defined by violence. Some fostered cooperation, learning, and exchange. The global networks that emerged from this era would eventually give rise to new forms of cultural expression, scientific discovery, and philosophical inquiry. The world that was taking shape was complex, interconnected, and dynamic, a world in which distant peoples were now part of a shared human story, bound together not only by trade and conflict, but by curiosity, innovation, and the enduring desire to understand the unknown. As the century progressed, the age of exploration continued to evolve. European powers faced new challenges, new rivals, and new opportunities. The dream of finding additional routes to Asia persisted, as did the desire to explore the vast Pacific. Expeditions would continue to push outward, mapping coastlines, crossing uncharted seas, and establishing new connections between societies. The transformative forces set in motion during these early decades would reverberate across generations, shaping the trajectories of nations and the lives of millions. Exploration had become more than a series of voyages. It had become a defining endeavor of humanity, a testament to the restless spirit that drives individuals and societies to seek what lies beyond the horizon.
The generation that followed the first conquests and circumnavigations inherited a world that was rapidly expanding but far from fully understood. Explorers, cartographers, merchants, missionaries, and monarchs all found themselves grappling with the implications of this new global landscape. The once fragmented knowledge of distant oceans and continents was beginning to cohere into a more unified geographical vision, but vast portions of the world remained cloaked in mystery. The Pacific, though crossed by Magellan's battered fleet, had barely been touched. North America lay largely unexplored beyond its coastlines, its rivers and plains only whispered about in stories passed from one indigenous nation to another. Africa, though deeply connected through its coastal trade networks, held interior realms that Europeans could neither comprehend nor penetrate. Asia, long the center of wealth and trade, was now confronting unfamiliar pressures from seaborne powers eager to insert themselves into ancient commercial systems. This was a historical moment defined by simultaneous discovery and uncertainty, by expansion and resistance, by possibility and peril. As Spain and Portugal consolidated their early gains, they increasingly faced the challenge of governing territories that stretched across oceans. Their empires were no longer confined to familiar cultural frameworks. They encompassed diverse societies with their own political traditions, religious systems, and economic structures. The administrative demands of such vast domains required new approaches to governance. Viceroyalties, audiencias, and other colonial institutions emerged to manage territories thousands of miles away. These systems attempted to impose order, extract wealth, and maintain loyalty to distant monarchs. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. Local leaders, indigenous rulers, and settlers often wielded power in ways that defied official expectations. The colonial world was not a monolithic extension of European authority, but a dynamic arena where competing interests shaped the course of history. At the same time, the ambitions of other European powers grew stronger. England, France, and the Netherlands had watched carefully as Spain and Portugal acquired immense wealth through their overseas ventures. These nations recognized that participation in exploration was no longer optional. It was essential for economic survival and national prestige. The seas had become the new battlegrounds of power, and each kingdom sought to master navigation, shipbuilding, and commercial strategy. This competition accelerated technological innovation. Ship designs evolved to improve speed, maneuverability, and cargo capacity. Navigation instruments became more precise. Printing presses produced maps and travel narratives that spread knowledge among merchants and scholars. Exploration was no longer the domain of a handful of monarch-funded adventurers. It had become a broader cultural and economic phenomenon, supported by growing networks of investors, scientists, and sailors. One of the earliest and most consequential ventures undertaken by rival European powers was the search for new routes through North America. The fabled Northwest Passage, a sea route that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, captured the imagination of English and French explorers. They believed that such a passage would offer a shorter and less contested path to the riches of Asia. Expeditions led by John Cabot, Jacques Cartier, Martin Frobisher, and later Henry Hudson, sought to pierce the icy labyrinth of northern waters. Each voyage carried hopes of finding a gateway that would elevate their nations into global trading powers. Yet the harsh realities of the Arctic quickly dispelled these optimistic visions. Icebergs, treacherous currents, hostile climates, and limited provisions turned many journeys into desperate struggles for survival. The sailors who ventured into these waters confronted a world that resisted European assumptions about dominance. Nature, in its unforgiving magnificence, dictated the terms of exploration. Although these missions failed to find the imagined passage, they revealed new regions to European consciousness. Cartier's voyages brought France into contact with St. Lawrence River and the peoples whose lives revolved around it. Hudson's journeys introduced England and the Netherlands to the vast interior waterways that would later form the backbone of colonial expansion. These encounters laid the foundations for future settlements, alliances, and rivalries. They also exposed Europeans to indigenous political landscapes that were far more sophisticated than they had anticipated. The nations and confederacies of North America maintained extensive diplomatic networks, trade systems, and conflict resolution traditions. They were not passive recipients of European influence, but active participants in shaping the interactions that would define the continent's future. While exploration continued in the north, the Pacific remained the most enigmatic of the world's oceans. Its currents, winds, and islands formed a complex system understood only by the peoples who had navigated it for centuries. Polynesian voyagers had mastered the Pacific long before Europeans dreamed of crossing it. They used stars, wave patterns, bird migrations, and subtle atmospheric cues to travel thousands of miles between distant archipelagos. Their maritime achievements represented one of the most remarkable feats of human navigation. Yet, for Europeans, the Pacific remained largely inaccessible. The coastlines of Asia offered some points of entry, but the enormous oceanic expanse discouraged attempts at systematic exploration. Only a few expeditions, often driven by missionary zeal or the hope of discovering new trade routes, dared to push into its heart. One such attempt came from the Spanish, who sought to link their American territories with their Asian outposts. After establishing themselves in the Philippines, they attempted to map reliable routes across the Pacific. These journeys were long, perilous, and often deadly. The Manila Galleons created a trans-Pacific trade route that connected Asia to the Americas and Europe, transporting silver, silk, spices, and porcelain. This commerce transformed global markets and introduced new cultural influences across continents. It also demonstrated that even the most daunting ocean could become a corridor for exchange when navigational knowledge reached a sufficient level of maturity. Still, much of the Pacific remained uncharted. Its vastness swallowed countless ships, leaving little trace of their fate. Beyond Asia and the Pacific, Africa continued to shape the trajectory of global exploration. European presence along its coasts expanded gradually, with fortified trading posts serving as hubs for commerce and negotiation. But these coastal positions did not grant Europeans access to the continent's deep interior, which remained governed by powerful kingdoms and states. The empires of West and Central Africa maintained control over trade networks that connected the Sahara, the Sahel, and the Atlantic. Gold, salt, textiles, and other goods flowed through these routes, sustaining political and economic systems that had evolved over centuries. When Europeans attempted to expand inland, they often encountered fierce resistance, environmental challenges, and political structures that defied simple conquest. Africa was not a passive frontier waiting to be explored. It was a dynamic and formidable region shaped by its own histories and identities. As global exploration accelerated, the consequences for indigenous populations grew increasingly severe. Disease remained the most devastating force. Epidemics spread rapidly through the Americas, reducing populations by staggering proportions. Entire communities disappeared, leaving behind cultural voids that would never be filled. Survivors faced new pressures as colonial institutions imposed unfamiliar laws, labor systems, and social hierarchies. Traditional knowledge systems, religious practices, and political structures were often suppressed or transformed under colonial rule. Yet indigenous resilience persisted. Communities adapted to new realities, blending old and new practices, resisting through rebellion or negotiation, and preserving cultural memory through storytelling, ceremony, and collective identity. Exploration reshaped their world, but it did not erase their agency. Meanwhile, Europe began experiencing profound intellectual shifts fueled by the knowledge acquired through exploration. Scholars examined exotic plants, animals, and minerals, incorporating them into emerging scientific frameworks. The natural world became a subject of systematic study rather than philosophical speculation. Botanical gardens, curiosity cabinets, and scientific societies emerged as centers for knowledge exchange. The voyages of discovery provided raw material for debates about climate, geography, biology, and human diversity. Questions once confined to theological doctrine now demanded empirical investigation. This growing emphasis on observation and classification laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, illustrating how exploration and science were intertwined forces shaping the modern world. Economic transformations also accelerated as global trade networks expanded. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil became engines of wealth and engines of suffering, powered by the labor of African slaves. The transatlantic slave trade became one of the darkest legacies of the age of exploration, binding continents together through a system of exploitation that reshaped demographics, economies, and cultural identities. European participation in this trade profoundly altered African societies, contributing to political instability, population displacement, and social fragmentation. The immense profits generated by slave labor fueled European development, industrialization, and imperial ambition, creating inequalities that would persist long after the end of formal colonization.
Yet exploration was not solely an instrument of conquest or exploitation. It also carried the potential for cross-cultural understanding, however fragile or uneven that understanding might be. Travelers recorded their observations of unfamiliar societies, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with prejudice. Their accounts became windows into worlds previously unknown to their readers. They described rituals, political systems, artistic traditions, and technologies that challenged European assumptions about civilization. Although these observations were often filtered through cultural biases, they contributed to a growing awareness of global diversity. This awareness, in turn, influenced philosophical debates about human nature, morality, and the organization of societies. The age of exploration expanded not only physical horizons, but intellectual and moral ones as well. As the 16th century progressed, the balance of power among European nations continued to shift. Spain and Portugal remained formidable, but the rise of maritime powers such as England and the Netherlands introduced new dynamics to global competition. Privateers, armed merchant fleets, and naval squadrons patrolled the seas, challenging Iberian dominance. The oceans were no longer controlled by a few states, but contested by many. This competition created opportunities for innovation in ship design, navigation, and military tactics. It also produced conflicts that spanned oceans, marking the beginnings of a truly global theater of warfare. Even as competition intensified, the spirit of exploration endured. New generations of sailors grew up hearing stories of distant lands, legendary riches, and heroic journeys. These narratives were woven into the cultural fabric of Europe, inspiring artists, writers, and intellectuals. Exploration became a symbol of human aspiration, a testament to curiosity and courage. Yet it also served as a reminder of the costs of ambition. The tragedies of shipwrecks, failed expeditions, and cultural destruction formed part of the collective memory of the era. Exploration was neither wholly noble nor wholly destructive. It was an endeavor shaped by the full spectrum of human motives: greed and generosity, fear and hope, ignorance and enlightenment. By the end of this period, the age of exploration had ushered in a world fundamentally different from the one that existed just a century earlier. Oceans that once separated civilizations had become conduits connecting them. Markets, technologies, and ideas flowed more freely than ever before. Empires expanded beyond regional boundaries, creating political structures that spanned continents. At the same time, new forms of inequality, exploitation, and conflict emerged, revealing the darker dimensions of global interconnectedness. The world had grown larger in scale, but also smaller in perception, as distant lands became part of a shared human geography. It was clear that exploration was entering a new phase, one that would involve deeper incursions into continental interiors, more systematic scientific observation, and more intense imperial rivalry. The foundations had been laid for future expeditions that would map river systems, chart coastlines, study flora and fauna, and engage with societies whose histories were intertwined with those of explorers. The story was far from over. The forces unleashed during this pivotal era would continue to shape migrations, economies, and political movements for centuries. The age of exploration had not just revealed the world, it had set humanity on a path toward a new global epoch, one defined by connection, transformation, and the ongoing pursuit of what lay beyond the distant horizon.
The 17th century emerged as a pivotal moment when exploration no longer revolved solely around the dramatic first encounters of the previous era, but shifted into a more systematic and strategic enterprise. The world that had once felt immeasurably vast now appeared to Europeans as a terrain that could be mapped, measured, and claimed. Nations were no longer content with scattered footholds on foreign shores. They sought to build durable empires, shape global trade, and embed themselves in the political and cultural landscapes of distant societies. Exploration, therefore, evolved into a machinery of empire, one driven by economic ambition, geopolitical rivalry, and the belief that the world was both knowable and conquerable. Yet beneath this layer of confidence lay deeper currents of uncertainty. Much of the Earth remained unmapped, and explorers continued to encounter peoples whose ways of life challenged European assumptions about civilization, technology, and human nature. The rise of new maritime powers dramatically reshaped the direction of exploration. The Netherlands, having secured independence from Spain after a prolonged and bitter struggle, emerged as one of the most formidable naval and commercial powers in the world. Dutch merchants, backed by innovative financial institutions and powerful trading companies, established networks spanning from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. The Dutch East India Company, one of the first corporations with quasi-governmental powers, became a driving force behind global commerce. It built fortified outposts, negotiated treaties, waged wars, and dispatched fleets to regions previously untouched by European influence. But Dutch expansion was not limited to profit alone. It also accelerated the collection of scientific knowledge. Dutch ships carried not only traders, but botanists, cartographers, and scholars who meticulously recorded their observations of plants, animals, landscapes, and cultures. Their journals and drawings enriched European understanding of the natural world and laid the foundations for new fields of study. France and England, recognizing the success of the Dutch, intensified their own efforts to establish overseas empires. In North America, the French pushed deeper into the continent, exploring rivers, forests, and plains in search of trade opportunities and strategic alliances. Figures like Samuel de Champlain, Louis Joliet, and Jacques Marquette ventured into the interior, encountering indigenous nations whose political structures and territorial knowledge were essential for navigating the vast wilderness. These interactions were not simply economic exchanges. They were diplomatic relationships that shaped the balance of power across the continent. Indigenous nations skillfully negotiated, resisted, or aligned with European newcomers based on their own political goals. The French, unlike the Spanish, were compelled to rely heavily on indigenous alliances, for their settlements were small and their populations limited. This reliance produced a different model of exploration, one grounded in negotiation, mutual adaptation, and cultural exchange, even as it ultimately served the broader aims of colonial expansion.
England, meanwhile, expanded its presence along the Atlantic coast. What began as fragile settlements, plagued by hunger, disease, and internal conflict, gradually transformed into thriving colonies. The English approach to exploration emphasized settlement and agricultural development, rather than the rapid accumulation of gold or silver. This model required extensive land, which inevitably generated conflict with indigenous communities, who had long shaped the ecological and political systems. Explorers and settlers pushed steadily westward, mapping rivers, valleys, and mountain ranges that would later become central to the identity of expanding colonial societies. The English also cultivated global trade networks that tied the Americas, Caribbean, and Africa into a triangular system of commerce. This system depended heavily on enslaved labor, marking yet another tragic transformation initiated by the Age of Exploration. While expansion continued across the Atlantic world, European involvement in Asia deepened in complexity. The Indian Ocean, once dominated by ancient trading networks and powerful Asian empires, became an arena where European ambitions collided with established systems of commerce and diplomacy. The Dutch, and the English in particular, sought to secure access to spices, textiles, and other valuable commodities that fueled European markets. This pursuit led them to establish increasingly assertive positions in regions such as India, Indonesia, and Japan. Yet success was never guaranteed. Asian polities possessed sophisticated military, economic, and diplomatic capabilities. The Mughals, Safavids, Ottomans, and numerous Southeast Asian states navigated European intrusion with strategies ranging from alliance building to outright exclusion. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate restricted European commerce and eliminated missionary influence, demonstrating that not all societies would yield to foreign pressures. Exploration, therefore, was not a one-sided process. It involved negotiation, adaptation, and resistance in equal measure. Even as Europeans expanded their influence across continents, the natural world continued to challenge the limits of human knowledge. Vast regions of the Earth remained inaccessible. Dense equatorial forests, towering mountain ranges, arid deserts, and polar extremes. Explorers began to undertake expeditions not merely in search of wealth or trade, but in pursuit of scientific understanding. The rise of natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, encouraged systematic observation and data collection. Travelers meticulously recorded climate patterns, ocean currents, mineral formations, and biological diversity. Their findings circulated through scientific societies, prompting debates about the origins of species, the structure of the Earth, and the mechanisms governing natural phenomena. Exploration became intertwined with the emergence of empirical science, reshaping not only geography, but the intellectual foundations of the modern world. One of the most transformative arenas of exploration during this period involved the great river systems of the world. Rivers served as vital arteries through which explorers penetrated inland territories. In South America, the immense Amazon River captured the imagination of Europeans, who marveled at its scale and biodiversity. Early expeditions ventured into its labyrinthine waterways, encountering countless communities whose livelihoods were intricately woven into the rhythms of the forest. These voyages often ended in tragedy, as navigators grappled with disease, hunger, and the overwhelming immensity of the rainforest. Yet they contributed to the first detailed maps of the region, shaping European perceptions of a continent that had previously been defined by mythic narratives of lost cities and untold riches.
In Africa, explorers pushed deeper into the interior by following rivers such as the Niger, Congo, and Zambezi. Yet, unlike the Americas, African societies possessed long-standing state systems, military capacities, and trade alliances that restricted European movement. Coastal powers controlled access to key routes, and environmental barriers made travel extremely difficult. As a result, exploration in Africa remained limited, and much of the continent remained unmapped by Europeans for centuries. This resistance to foreign intrusion reinforced European fantasies about Africa as an enigmatic and impenetrable region, even though African civilizations had well-developed systems of governance, trade, and education. The age of exploration revealed the limits of European reach just as much as it showcased its expanding ambitions. Meanwhile, the Pacific continued to occupy a central place in the European imagination. The dreamy narratives of vast islands, unknown empires, and possible southern continents fueled a new wave of expeditions. Although earlier Spanish and Portuguese ventures had touched parts of the Pacific, the ocean remained largely uncharted. Mariners dreamed of discovering Terra Australis Incognita, the mythical southern continent believed to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere. Though the continent they imagined did not exist, their belief in it motivated journeys that would eventually lead to the mapping of Australia, New Zealand, and numerous Pacific archipelagos. These regions, long navigated by indigenous cultures, became zones of European curiosity and eventual colonization. As exploration deepened, its cultural consequences intensified. European languages, religions, and political institutions spread across continents, transforming indigenous societies. Missionaries worked to convert populations, often challenging existing spiritual systems, while also documenting languages and traditions. Their writings, though shaped by cultural biases, preserved valuable knowledge about societies that would later face profound disruption. Artists and writers in Europe drew inspiration from encounters with unfamiliar cultures, producing works that simultaneously reflected admiration and exoticization. Philosophers debated the meaning of cultural difference and the nature of humanity, with some arguing that all people shared common rational capacities, while others used exploration narratives to justify imperial hierarchies. The age of exploration thus sparked intellectual transformations that reverberated far beyond the voyages themselves.
Economic consequences also became increasingly visible. Europeans developed global systems of extraction, transportation, and consumption. Silver from the Americas flowed into Asian markets, linking continents in unprecedented economic circulation. Sugar, tobacco, fur, spices, textiles, and porcelain became integral to European lifestyles. Yet these luxuries relied on systems of labor that inflicted immense suffering on colonized and enslaved peoples. Plantations, mines, and trade routes formed the backbone of emerging global capitalism, embedding exploitation into the very infrastructure of the expanding world. Exploration, therefore, became both a symbol of human possibility and a reminder of the costs at which that possibility was pursued.
Despite the vast changes unfolding across continents, exploration retained a deeply personal dimension. The individuals who embarked on dangerous journeys often did so with motivations that blended ambition, curiosity, fear, and hope. Their writings reveal the emotional texture of the era, the exhilaration of discovery, the terror of storms and shipwrecks, the loneliness of months at sea, the awe of encountering unfamiliar landscapes, and the moral dilemmas posed by cultural contact. These human experiences form an essential layer of the age of exploration, reminding us that history is shaped not only by empires and economies, but by the choices, dreams, and struggles of countless individuals whose names are often forgotten. By the late 17th century, the age of exploration had transformed the world into an interconnected mosaic of trade networks, colonial territories, scientific collaborations, and cultural exchanges. Yet the process was incomplete. Large regions of the Earth remained unmapped, and the expansion of empires had only begun to reshape global politics in ways that would define the centuries to come. Exploration had revealed the world, but it had not resolved the tensions unleashed by that revelation. Conflicts over land, labor, sovereignty, and identity continued to intensify. The oceans were no longer barriers, but contested spaces where nations fought for dominance. The next phase of exploration would bring even greater scientific inquiry, deeper intrusions into continental interiors, and more intense imperial competition. The age of exploration, once characterized by isolated voyages and dramatic encounters, had matured into a global system, a system that connected continents, economies, and cultures in a dense web of interactions. This system would soon give rise to the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the modern nation-state. The foundations laid during this era would shape the trajectory of human history, influencing everything from scientific thought to economic structures to cultural identity. The world had changed irrevocably, and exploration had been the catalyst for that change.
As the 18th century dawned, exploration entered a new era defined not only by territorial expansion, but also by a profound intellectual transformation. The world had been partially charted through centuries of voyages, yet vast spaces remained unknown, and even familiar regions demanded deeper understanding. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on empirical observation, scientific classification, and rational inquiry, breathed new life into the project of exploration. Scholars, monarchs, and scientific academies joined forces with navigators, transforming distant voyages into mobile laboratories of knowledge. Exploration became less about the dramatic first contact with unfamiliar peoples, and more about documenting the intricacies of nature, mapping coastlines with precision, and developing global systems for understanding climate, biology, and geography. This new fusion of science and empire would shape not only the knowledge produced during the 18th century, but the trajectory of global development long into the future. One of the most defining figures of this era was Captain James Cook, whose expeditions dramatically expanded the known geography of the Pacific and set new standards for scientific exploration. Cook's voyages were conducted with an unprecedented degree of preparation, reflecting both naval ambition and scholarly rigor.
Naturalists, astronomers, artists, and botanists accompanied the crews, tasked with recording every observable detail. Their mission extended far beyond the search for land or trade routes. They were to measure celestial events, chart coastlines with mathematical precision, identify new species, and learn from the societies they encountered. Cook's expeditions epitomized the Enlightenment's belief that knowledge could be systematically collected, organized, and applied to improve human understanding of the world. The Pacific, long an ocean of mystery, gradually revealed its contours through these voyages. Cook charted vast stretches of Australia and New Zealand, mapped numerous island chains, and discredited the long-standing myth of a massive southern continent balancing the Earth's land masses. He also interacted with Pacific Island societies, whose navigational skills, social systems, and cultural traditions had developed independently over centuries. These encounters, though often peaceful and grounded in mutual curiosity, were also marked by miscommunication, conflict, and the growing shadow of European imperialism. Cook, like earlier explorers, represented both the spirit of inquiry and the expansionist ambitions of his homeland. His death in Hawaii symbolized the precarious balance between cooperation and confrontation that characterized many cross-cultural interactions during this period. Even as Cook and others mapped the Pacific, scientific expeditions flourished across the world. European academies sponsored journeys to measure the Earth's shape, determine the movement of celestial bodies, and collect data on climate variations. These missions sought answers to fundamental questions. Was the planet perfectly spherical or slightly flattened at the poles? How did latitude influence temperature and weather? Could a universal system of measurement be created based on astronomical observations? Explorers traveled to South America, Africa, the Arctic, and Asia to conduct experiments in remote locations. Their instruments, quadrants, chronometers, barometers became essential tools in the global project of scientific discovery.
The pursuit of knowledge during this era also reflected broader geopolitical ambitions. Accurate maps were crucial for military strategy, commerce, and colonization. Scientific expeditions often paved the way for imperial ventures, providing detailed information about resources, populations, and vulnerabilities. The relationship between science and empire was complex, inspiring profound advancements in human understanding while simultaneously enabling new forms of domination and exploitation. Naturalists documented species that would later be transported across continents, reshaping ecosystems. Cartographers drew borders that often ignored indigenous territorial systems, laying the groundwork for later conflicts. Exploration had become inseparable from the structures of power emerging in the modern world. In the Americas, European expansion reached deeper into the interior as settlers, traders, and soldiers advanced beyond coastal regions. The once fragmented knowledge of North America's geography evolved into detailed maps of mountains, rivers, and plains. Explorers documented the diversity of indigenous societies, whose languages, political alliances, and cultural practices varied widely across the continent. These communities engaged with Europeans in ways that reflected their own strategic interests, forming alliances, negotiating trade, or resisting encroachment through military and diplomatic means. The struggle for sovereignty intensified as European settlements expanded, leading to conflicts that reshaped demographics, territories, and cultural landscapes. Exploration in this context was not an isolated act of discovery, but part of an evolving process of confrontation and negotiation between societies with deeply rooted histories. South America also became a focal point for scientific exploration. The Andes, with their dramatic geological formations, drew naturalists seeking to understand the relationship between altitude and climate, the distribution of species, and the origins of mountain ranges. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most influential scientific travelers of the era, embarked on journeys that blended rigorous measurement with poetic reflection. His work revealed the interconnectedness of ecological systems, demonstrating how geography shaped culture, climate, and biological diversity. Humboldt's approach laid the foundations for modern environmental science and influenced generations of thinkers, including Darwin. Exploration, through figures like Humboldt, transcended imperial boundaries and became a means of revealing the fundamental unity of the natural world. Meanwhile, Africa continued to challenge explorers with its vast environmental diversity and strong political structures. European knowledge of the continent remained largely coastal, shaped by trade networks and limited interactions. Yet the 18th century witnessed growing curiosity about Africa's interior. Myths persisted about rich kingdoms, hidden lakes, and the mysterious sources of great rivers such as the Nile and Niger. These stories inspired expeditions that sought to map the continent and identify potential trade routes. However, explorers confronted formidable obstacles: disease, climate, and resistance from well-organized states. Africa refused to conform to European fantasies of easy penetration. This enduring mystery contributed to the continent's symbolic role in European imagination, often depicted as the last frontier for exploration, even though its societies possessed complex histories that predated European arrival by millennia.
The Arctic and Antarctic regions also became arenas for exploration as sailors sought new routes, natural resources, and scientific data. The quest for the Northwest Passage persisted, fueled by improved ship designs and a growing belief that perseverance might reveal a navigable route through the polar seas. Expeditions ventured into icy waters, battling harsh conditions that pushed human endurance to the limit. Though many missions ended in tragedy, the accumulated observations of climate, ice patterns, and geography contributed to a deeper understanding of polar environments. These explorations highlighted the unpredictability of nature and the limits of human ambition, even in an age of expanding scientific capability. As exploration deepened scientific understanding, it also transformed global cultural landscapes. Missionaries carried religious teachings across continents, establishing schools, churches, and networks of converts. Traders introduced new goods that altered local economies and consumption practices. Colonizers imposed political institutions that restructured societies, often violently. At the same time, indigenous knowledge, long marginalized or dismissed, played an essential role in facilitating exploration. Local guides, navigators, and scholars provided information about landscapes, resources, and survival strategies. Their contributions, though often unacknowledged, formed the backbone of many expeditions. The age of exploration, therefore, was not solely a European achievement. It was a global encounter shaped by collaboration, conflict, exchange, and adaptation. The intellectual consequences of exploration extended far beyond geography and natural history. Encounters with diverse cultures challenged European assumptions about society, governance, and human potential. Enlightenment philosophers debated the nature of freedom, equality, and morality through the lens of global diversity. Some thinkers argued that exposure to unfamiliar belief systems demonstrated the universality of human reason, while others used cultural differences to justify imperial hierarchies. These debates influenced political movements that would reshape the world, from the American and French revolutions to struggles for independence in colonized regions. Exploration, therefore, did not directly contribute to the emergence of new political ideologies and concepts of human rights. Economically, the 18th century solidified global trade networks that had begun forming 2 centuries earlier. Commodities flowed across oceans with increasing regularity: tea from China, coffee from Arabia, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from the Americas, and spices from Southeast Asia.
European consumption patterns shifted dramatically as exotic goods became embedded in daily life. Yet this prosperity was built on systems of forced labor and resource extraction that disproportionately harmed colonized peoples. Plantations expanded, indigenous lands were seized, and enslaved Africans endured unimaginable suffering. The wealth generated through these networks financed further exploration, creating a cycle in which scientific advancement and exploitation were deeply intertwined.
Despite the widespread belief that the world was becoming knowable, exploration continued to confront unexpected realities. New species, geological formations, and cultural practices consistently challenged existing theories. Each discovery revealed that the world was more complex than previously imagined. This sense of endless mystery fueled further inquiry and inspired individuals who sought not only to map the world, but to comprehend its underlying principles. Exploration had become a profound philosophical journey, one that questioned the boundaries of human knowledge and the structure of the universe itself. By the end of the 18th century, the age of exploration had reached a critical turning point. The major outlines of the world's continents and oceans were established, scientific methods had been integrated into exploration, and global trade networks were firmly in place. Yet the legacy of this era was not merely geographical or economic. It was deeply human. Exploration revealed the vast diversity of cultures and environments that shared the planet, highlighting both the interconnectedness and the conflicts that define human history. The encounters between societies produced new forms of knowledge, new technologies, and new cultural expressions, but they also generated displacement, violence, and inequality whose consequences persist to this day. The 19th century would bring a new phase of exploration, focused on penetrating continental interiors, mapping remote regions, and asserting imperial control with increasing technological power. Steamships, railways, improved weaponry, and industrial resources enabled deeper incursions into areas once inaccessible. Exploration became an instrument of empire more decisively than ever before, shaping borders and political systems that still influence the modern world. Yet the foundations for this new epoch had been laid during the earlier centuries of maritime exploration, centuries defined by curiosity, ambition, conflict, and the relentless pursuit of understanding. Looking back across the vast narrative of the age of exploration, one sees not a simple story of discovery, but a complex tapestry woven from countless human experiences. It is a story of navigators who braved oceans with little more than stars to guide them, of indigenous peoples who navigated the challenges of foreign intrusion with resilience and wisdom, of scholars who transformed fragmented observations into global knowledge, and of empires that rose and fell in pursuit of distant horizons. It is a story shaped by acts of courage and acts of violence, by cooperation and conflict, by imagination and misunderstanding. Above all, it is a story that reflects the human desire to know the world and the profound consequences that arise when that desire becomes a force capable of reshaping the planet. As the age of exploration drew to a close, it left behind a world irreversibly connected. Oceans that had once separated civilizations now linked them in networks of trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, and peoples circulated across continents with increasing frequency. The Earth, once a realm of mystery, had become a shared human space, mapped, measured, contested, and celebrated. Yet the legacy of exploration remained deeply ambivalent, marked by both the achievements of scientific discovery and the enduring wounds of colonization and exploitation. In this balance of light and shadow lies the true history of exploration, a history that continues to shape the modern world and reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge carries both immense power and profound responsibility.